Oops. Can you tell that's me? Can you tell that's me, Rose? We need to get a little mini Bitmoji Rose that I can put up there every now. I can make it pop up every now and then when we need a little fun. Let's work on that. I really wish so much that I had filled this with water before. You're close to the door. Wait, actually, the drinking fountain is back there. Oh, you could just go to the ladies' room and just use from the sink, not the toilet, from the sink. Of course, I won't know. All right, let me have a second to do that. We could still do a full 30-minute class. I know on the 4th of July I did the same thing because it feels like a holiday and like we should be goofing off and going out and watching fireworks, and we were all here, so I know I didn't get a whole lot of the text studied. Let me just tell you this, though. You remember I said we're just finishing this textual criticism, and then we're going right into a survey or overview of each of the Gospels so that we can then study Mark. I've added one last area of study, though, before that. I know you're shocked. But unlike all the stuff we were just looking at, it's very it's very practical and helpful, and I think you'll like it. And it's going to be. Thank you. Is it a half calf skinny mocha latte? That's what I want. It's the Bob Ross cup. Thank you. That helped a lot. So it's principles for interpreting the Gospels, some things to keep in mind, and very practical. And so I'll upload the 2 files that have all the textual criticism on it. Those will be files 7 and 8, but I have to heavily edit them and get some pictures out of them because they're really large files. And then, but I'll upload this one. You'll see that if we get to it, that goes through the principles of interpreting the Gospel. You're going to need all that. There's a lot of passages and principles that are set out in that file. So those of you who are the note takers or who've been following the files, I'll make sure to get that uploaded. So, okay, here we go. All right, I want to start with, like I did before, with a couple of, well, at least one correction. In the previous class, I went back and watched it. I knew I wasn't saying something quite right, and so it was bothering me. And I said obulus, and then the plural is obuli, and that was kind of bothering me. So I knew there was something, I couldn't get the word right in my head at that time. And it's not this, okay? It's not an obelisk. That's a little bit hard to see there, some of you at the bottom of the screen. That's an obelisk. This is an obolus. So it sounds very similar. But it's the markings that we see, like an asterisk, in the margin of some of the manuscripts that indicate to the transcriber, to the scribe, that there was apparently some discrepancy or some issue or some correction with the text. So sometimes you'll see a symbol like this in the manuscripts, an asterisk like that, written like that, or an obulus, also called a lemniscus, where you see like a division sign or a slanted division sign like that. Those are markings like that indicate some issue, and they really help us to see where there were textual problems. So this is from the Gospel of John. In fact, this is called the pericope adulteri. We're going to look at that, the case of the woman taken in adultery. I believe this is from a manuscript. And you see something over here in the margin like that? See, that's sometimes you'll see a marking, and then here in the text is that lemniscus, or there's an obelisk there. And sometimes it's just an umlaut, the 2 dots that you'll see like over German words. That's not in Russia, is it, the umlaut? You don't use the 2 dots over vowels, right? But you find that in German, right? Like you see here, it's often the side on the manuscript. Well, they'll put a mark like either a mistake in the text they're correcting, or some question about whether something belongs in the text. So remember, the tendency was to want to include something if you weren't sure. This is all in the last class. If you didn't see it, it's uploaded to the site. the tendency was to keep something that you were unsure of rather than to leave something out if you were in doubt. But often they would make these marks or these little notes, and we said sometimes, the problem is they would find their way into the actual text, some of these notations or comments. And here's a blown up view of it. You can see a little bit better right there if I tell it to go to the top there. You can see that little mark. All right, well, those are helpful in textual criticism. So I said I wanted to make textual critics out of you, so I'm going to give a few examples. We did one example at the end of class last time, where we're taking these criteria that textual critics use to, when there are textual variants, to try to come up with what is most likely the correct reading, the original reading of the text. And they do this by looking at the external evidence and the internal evidence. Now, I already explained all that last time, but as we go to some of these examples, remember these principles we gave, that generally the shorter, there are exceptions always, but the shorter reading is generally preferred because scribes were more inclined to add things that didn't need to be there than to leave something out because of their desire to preserve the Word of God. So oftentimes then the shorter reading will typically be the correct one, and the longer reading is because they added something that they were unsure of that really wasn't part of the original text. Now there are other factors involved in that, but I've simplified this greatly and reduced it to just a couple of points. There are many other factors or principles that could be included, and the more difficult readings preferred. We explained all that last time, why that is, and that we don't want to just count how many manuscript copies we have behind a reading, but weigh the quality of those. So I'm not going to go back through that again, but look at now a few more examples. We looked at the one about, I'm going to go back to about Joseph and his mother versus saying they were his parents. Okay, but let's look at this one. Here you have the King James is on the right, I believe, and here you have a reading. It's at the very end of the book of Luke. This is a good example of one that's trivial. It's not all that important, but look at verse 53. The very last verse here in the book of Luke says they were continually in the temple blessing God. Okay? Now in the King James, it says praising and blessing God. So why is there a word missing from modern translations, like the ESV? Well, that's because some manuscripts will say they were praising God. Others will say they were blessing God. Now, if you were a scribe and you had both of these in front of you, let's say you have this parent copy that you're working from, but you have access to other manuscripts, and you see some of them say they were praising God and others say they were blessing God, it's easy to see how the temptation would be, if you're unsure, to just put them both in there, right? And so in the Textus Receptus, that it comes from the Byzantine family largely, and essentially really just based on a handful of very late manuscripts, that's what ended up being in the text that Erasmus used that formed the basis of the text behind the King James Version. And so you have praising and blessing God, whereas in the newer translations, as we go back to, we have other manuscript evidence, and it's most likely the original reading was just praising God, right? Okay, so that's an easy one. That's called, by the way, conflation, right? Where they're conflating something. We do that sort of thing ourselves a lot. Now, Luke 2, as I mentioned, you have this issue, I believe, in verse 31, and then again in verse 33, or rather verse 33, and then again in verse 41 and verse 43. All right, his father and his mother you have in Samuel, you talked about this, at the end of class, right? And then older translations like the King James will say Joseph and his mother. And then down further in verse 41, his parents versus, now his parents stays in the King James there, but down in verse 43, staying behind, his parents did not know it, but over here, Joseph and his mother didn't know it. Well, on that principle that scribes would tend to make less difficult rather than to introduce a difficulty that's there. Now, those of you who weren't here Sunday, what would you think would be the original reading, and why would they want to alter that? What's the problem if we say Joseph is Jesus' father, right? That puts in jeopardy the virgin birth in the minds of some. And so the tendency would be to say, well, that's a mistake, or that needs clarification. It's not really his parents. They weren't actually both his parents. They weren't his flesh and blood parents, both of them. And so Joseph and his mother, we find that being introduced into texts that later end up in our Bibles, right? Does that make sense? So you're just thinking through some of these textual principles, and I'm giving you some examples here. Now, let me ask you about this one. Here's a new one. All right. Which is the more likely reading here? You have two manuscript traditions in front of you, maybe two groups of manuscripts or two individual manuscripts. And when it talks about Jesus' crucifixion in Luke 23:32, one says he was crucified with two other criminals. Another says with two others who were criminals. What's the problem with saying Jesus was crucified with two other criminals? That, right? If I say, Barry, would you come up here, please, and take a seat with the other idiots? Well, now, wouldn't he say, hey, right? That kind of implies, well, it does imply that I'm insulting him too, right? So you can see, well, the two other criminals, that's the more difficult reading. Why would a scribe change the reading here to others who are criminals and make it difficult for the reader? And why would he want to introduce a difficulty, a problem that the reader would have to address? No, it's far more likely that two other criminals, right? You see the point? It's far more likely that is the original reading, and because it is difficult, the attempt to sort of clarify that or say it differently would be how the text became altered in other manuscripts. You see that? Where a scribe thinks, well, that must be a mistake, I need to correct that. See, he wasn't a criminal. But now how would we explain it? If it says two other criminals in the original reading, how would we explain that? If that's the correct reading.
Well, in the eyes of the people he was.
Right. The perception. He was being crucified as a criminal with the other ones who were also perceived as a criminal. And now in their case, that perception was correct, but in Jesus' case it wasn't. So, but you see that is a more difficult reading. All right, have you ever wondered about this reading in John 5? Look at the text over here in the ESV where we're told about when Jesus healed the man at the pool of Bethesda. And the ESV says it was called Bethesda, and there were 5 roof colonnades, so this is a very distinctive area that was identified by that. And it said, in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. And then, so here you go, from verse 3 to verse 5. Is that a mistake in the numbering? Where's verse 4? Well, if you have the King James, and I believe also the New King James, verse 4, there's this verse 4 here that isn't in newer translations. And in verse 4, it says, for an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water, And whosoever then first, after the troubling of the water, stepped in, was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. Well, that's considered a later addition to the text that was not part of the original text, because the more reliable textual evidence we have does not include that. But that appears to be a common tradition or belief that people held. Doesn't it have, just as you look at it and you think about the internal evidence, doesn't it have sort of the ring of kind of a urban legend sort of a thing, that an angel would come and stir the water and whoever got in first would be healed? We hear about people traveling around the world to get healing from touching relics or places where allegedly statues have moved, or whether there's been appearances of so-called saints or things of that nature. Well, we still encounter that sort of thing today. Well, the reason that's missing from modern translations is there's really no good textual evidence to support including it. So yes, that is in the King James Bible and some older Bibles, but because of the things we've been studying, you see why it's been left out of newer translations. All right, now a big one is John 8 and what's called the pericope. We've already said that word just means a specific episode or incident, an account, an individual account in the narrative. So the pericope adulterae, the Latin term for the adultery, the woman taken in adultery. And really notice it starts with the last verse of John 7, and then the first and then down through chapter 8 verse 11. Now if you just take this right out of John's gospel and you go from verse 52 of chapter 7 right to chapter 8 verse 12, it flows perfectly. But it was inserted here in some manuscripts, and in other manuscripts it's inserted in another place in John, and then some even put it in Luke. It's like scribes didn't know what to do with this historic account, which apparently is very ancient. Early church fathers cite it very, very early on in church history. It appears to be an oral tradition that is apostolic, apparently, although I don't know if we can say that for sure. I teach from it, and I'll preach it, and I did a lesson here on Sunday night a while back. It appears to have been an incident in the life of Jesus that was preserved by oral tradition, eventually was written down. We talked about this process of transmission, and some were trying to find a way to include it. But you remember we said we look at, I love some of these images you can find about this very poignant, very powerful encounter that Jesus has with the woman. It's just profound. The whole interplay between Jesus and the Jewish leaders, Jesus and the woman, the whole tension of it, and the way Jesus brilliantly resolves it. The theology, it's great to look at and study. However, when you look at, remember the two areas of evidence, the external evidence shows it really shouldn't be there. The internal evidence, it does not read, especially if you look at the Greek, it does not fit with the language and the style of writing of John. It just interrupts the text like something foreign that was thrust into the reading, trying to find a place to put it. And that's why it appears in different places in different manuscripts. And I love the way some have visualized it and portrayed it. This is in our classic artwork. I don't know the name of this painting from the, I believe from the Reformation era, but it's one that you often find if you Google the pericope adulterae. All right, so here I want to show you the markations, though, what this means in your Bible. So here you have, notice, this is the ESV on the left, and then the New King James on the right. So notice right here, this. The earliest manuscripts do not include 743 through 753 rather through 8 and verse 11. And so you'll see right here there are double brackets around it to indicate that the authors, the compilers of the Greek texts that were used for the ESV felt like it has the ring of credibility and does appear very early in a lot of manuscripts, but it does not belong in John's gospel, and in fact that's noted. But see here in the New King James Version, there's just a footnote. It reads along with the rest of the text, and there's just a footnote, and I've included the footnotes, but I wanted to show you something here that, let's see if I've got it, that is a little bit misleading. Well, what's a little bit misleading is when it says the earliest manuscripts, or really in this. Notice the footnote then in the ESV says some manuscripts do not include 7:53 through 8:11. Others add the passage here or after 7:36 or after 21:25 or after Luke 21:38, and then when you find it in these manuscripts, there's a lot of variations of how it reads from one copy to another. See, so there are these issues with the text. There are some of these problems. Now, what's a little bit misleading here that I want to note is it says some. Well, we'll get to that. Well, I'm actually confusing what I want to say about the ending of Mark with this here. Okay, so you'll see now in the New King James there's a note. Now watch this. Now will come into play something we talked about earlier. The New King James has this note telling you that the Greek text brackets it and as not in the original text. But now watch what it says here. They are present in 900 manuscripts of John. 900? Wow, that's a lot. But what have we said? What's important in the external evidence? Not necessarily the number, but the quality. Not the quantity, but the quality. Because you remember we pointed out here, you could have an errant copy where, for example, in this case right here, there's a mistake here. And that mistake is proliferated through this whole body of copies. Let's see if I can make all that. Yeah, let me do this. Now watch. You remember we said it may look like, look, there's way more copies of that. There may be hundreds of copies of that, and there are fewer. But clearly, if you trace the correct reading from the parallel accounts from the same periods, okay, if each one of these represents a different period as you come closer, as you go back closer and closer to the original, and we can find it then preserved, we can look at and say, well, it doesn't matter how many copies, but see, you might read that footnote in the New King James Version and think, well, that's a lot of manuscripts, so I guess it should be in our Bible. But see, now you're a textual critic, and you know, well, wait a minute, that's not necessarily the case, right? That's not necessarily the case. So I made a mess out of that slide. Remind me not to save this presentation at the end, or I'll wreck it before I can upload it with all these markings. Okay? So, all right, before we look at the one in Luke 22, any question or comment on the pericope adulterae? I know Ruth's going to be throwing that saying around, makes her feel smarticle. I saw a shirt I want to get that says, I use big words I don't understand because I want to sound really photosynthesis. Thought that was kind of funny.
Like too with this is you have to be careful about being sure of the dates of some of these manuscripts. You say, well, you go back and back and back and you find something that's different than a lot of the newer ones perhaps, but you got to know which one belongs where on that.
Right, now that involves a tremendous amount of very tedious, involved study where there's a great deal of expertise in that area of dating. A lot of times they can do it by the style of writing. For example, we know minuscules, as I pointed out, that style of writing didn't even come along and wasn't even really developed till the 9th century. So if you find a minuscule with that flowing cursive text, it's not like the early manuscripts we have that are uncials or majuscules in all capital letters. But once that kind of writing took hold, it was much faster and much easier, and it quickly became the standard from that century on. So right there is an easy way to date manuscripts. And then we talked about, well, let me get through these examples. But you're right, though, it's very involved. And at some point, we are trusting these experts, to give us the information we need to make an evaluation. Now, this very moving text that's been a part of a lot of sermons and a lot of our songs. Look at verse 43 and 44 of Luke 22. There appeared to him an angel from heaven. This is when he was praying in the garden, strengthening him, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. What song is it that we sing that in? Someone will think of it. It's yes, very, very moving song, very touching song. The problem is that really, it's my understanding, that really shouldn't be part of Luke's gospel. Again, like the pericope adulteri, though, it appears to have been something preserved in oral tradition, and that was later inserted into the margin and then finally made its way into the text. And there are footnotes in various passages that will tell you about the problem with it. Like in this particular case, you'll see the footnote will say, most early now, see? Most early manuscripts do not contain verse 33 and 34. Now, what was the principle we said earlier? What would a scribe be more likely to do? To look at something, he's got a manuscript copy. He doesn't have let's say he doesn't have the original in front of him, but he's got a copy or a certain family or tradition here, a line of copies, and it has those verses in it. Why would he take them out if they were actually in the original? Now, some would argue, well, it must be a scribe took them out because that would seem to contradict Jesus' deity, that his humanity struggled so much with that kind of pain. But that we know that's the reasoning some will use to say, that's possibly why they just took it out and put it in the margin instead, because of the way it made Jesus look less than divine in going through his agony. But of course, the Gospels talk about his suffering. Now, that's probably the one statement, maybe except for "I thirst." 2 words in English on the cross that convey how brutal, how unthinkable the agony of being crucified was. Those words, there's a whole sermon in that. But Jesus did suffer. He did suffer. But some might think, well, that's a problem. But it's far, far more likely that a scribe would insert them because he felt they should be there and weren't in the copy he had, than to think a scribe would take out something from the Word of God, right? That's looking at it from both the external evidence and the internal evidence. So you see that. Now let me just mention a couple others. Matthew 19, at the end of verse 9, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for another, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Well, wait, there's a footnote here, though, that tells you, well, some manuscripts add, whoever marries what about that woman? Okay, that was divorced. Is she free to remarry? Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Other manuscripts say, except for sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So it's not in the ESV, that part is not in Matthew 19:9. In the text, it's in a footnote. But it should not be a concern, because Matthew 5:32, which is not a textual variant that's in question, contains that statement, as well as the parallel account in Luke about the woman who's put away doesn't have a right to remarry either. So that we're not losing something there, like some will be alarmed that, well, you couldn't teach somebody the truth. People will say things like that. You can't teach somebody the truth about divorce and remarriage from your Bible. Now, I will say the NIV is a problem here, because it renders, if you have the NIV, instead of sexual immorality, it says unfaithfulness or marital unfaithfulness. And that's the word porneia in the Greek text means a sex act, sexual act, an act of sexual immorality. Whereas if you just broaden that to unfaithfulness, you might think, well, my wife, she kept hitting the garage door when she was backing the car out. And so she was not a very faithful spouse. I mean, that could be construed in so many other ways. And then there's just one final one I was going to mention from John. That final example, this final example I want to use is right here. The difference between saying that he's the only God in verse 18 versus the Son. And I mentioned that in a Sunday night sermon, and we didn't go into it in detail. And really, that's all to kind of set up what we're going to encounter with the long ending of Mark. I'm not going to discuss it and try to settle it with you in this class, but just so you understand why it's a problem and not to be alarmed about it and how we'll look at it when we get to it. So all of that, so that what I want to do next, just so you know, I know I'm keeping you over. Thanks for the extra minute. And for those watching the video later, it's January 22nd. It's the 47th anniversary of the Roe versus Wade decision. And we spent the beginning of class talking a little bit about that and praying about that, so the class is shorter. But what we're getting to is this. I'm going to give you some principles, some guidelines for interpreting the gospel and the gospel accounts, and I'll get these uploaded so that you can have them for class if you want to have them ahead of time Sunday morning. A lot of good, practical, important, and here's my word that I'm overusing, interesting stuff coming up. Believe me, trust me, it's so interesting. You're going to benefit from it. So
it's important too, because
and
something that's been happening in brotherhood for the last 15 years is attempt to change the hermeneutics.
yeah, and to even eliminate the Gospels as part of the New Testament. Is that what you're talking about?
No. Just to change how you interpret things to make it whatever it is you want.
Yeah, so these guidelines I think will be really helpful. Thank you so much for indulging me tonight. I hope our time together was as helpful for you as it's been for me.